Hello and welcome back to the People of Sparks. We find ourselves on chapter 4. It's titled The Doctor's House. Makes sense because we are following Dr. Hester, Warren, Mrs. Murdo, Poppy, and Lena to Dr. Hester's house. Dr. Hester will be hosting them this evening, meaning that is where Mrs. Murdo, Poppy, and Lena will sleep and be fed for the evening. The other people of Ember have been some of them are sleeping in the plaza, but those who are elderly or those who are sick or those who have children have been taken in by the villagers, and they'll be sleeping in these strange houses with strangers. It's very charitable and very kind what the people of Sparks are doing for these refugees, for these people who have had to leave their home because of adverse or awful conditions. So let's find ourselves on page 36, please. The doctor's house. The sky had turned a deep blue now, almost black. At one edge shone a streak of brilliant crimson. In the houses of the village, one window and then another began to glow with a flickering yellow light. They walked and walked. Each time they came to a doorway or a gate in the wall or stairs leading upward, Lena hoped that this would be the house. Back in Ember, where she'd had the job of messenger, she had been a tireless runner. Running was her greatest joy. Tonight, it was hard just to walk. She was so tired, her feet felt like bricks. What a great simile. But Dr. Hester walked on and on, with the boy trotting ahead of her sometimes, and sometimes lagging behind to stare at Lena and Mrs. Murdo and Poppy, until they came to the outer edge of the village. There, standing somewhat apart, was a low-roofed house. Except for a glimmer of light on its two windows reflected from the reddening sky, it was in darkness, huddled beneath the great brooding plant the shape of a huge mushroom. "Is that a pine tree?" Lena asked the doctor. "Oak tree," the doctor said. So Lena understood that tree must mean all big plants and that they came in different kinds. A path led to a wooden gate, which the doctor opened. They came into a shadowy, leaf-littered courtyard paved with uneven bricks. On three sides there were three wings of the house, like a square-cornered U. The eaves of the roof sloped down to form a walkway all the way around. In the failing light, Lena could just see that the courtyard was crowded with plants, some growing in the ground and some in pots of all sizes. Vines wound up the columns of the walkway and crawled along the edge of the roof. "Come inside," the doctor said. She led the way into the door of the central part of the house. She and the boy went in. Lena stopped just inside the doorway, and Mrs. Murdo came up behind her, Poppy in her arms. They stood peering into the gloom. There was an odd, pungent smell. If something is pungent, it's a very sharp-smelling scent. And there was a pungent smell, like mushrooms or leaf mold, only sharper. The doctor disappeared for a moment, and when she came back, she held a lit candle. She moved around the room, lighting more. 2 candles, 3 candles, 4, until a wavery light filled the central part of the room. The corners remained in darkness. Come in," the doctor said patiently. Lena moved forward. She felt grit beneath the soles of her shoes and the tickle of dust in her nose. She was in a long, low room with clutter everywhere. Clutter means that things were just strewn about. Nothing was organized. Clothes draped over the backs of armchairs, a shoe on a saggy couch, a plate with some bits of food on it sitting on the windowsill. At one end of the room, there were 2 doors, both of them closed. At the back, a stairway rose into a dark square hole in the ceiling. At the other end of the room, in a corner, was an open doorway leading, Lena guessed, to the kitchen. Beside this doorway was a kind of hollow in the wall, framed by stones and containing some sticks and some scraps of paper. The doctor stooped down below this hollow place and held her candle to the sticks and paper there. In a moment, a flame leapt up. It was a bigger flame than Lena had ever seen, like a terrible orange hand reaching up and out. Lena's heart knocked hard against her ribs. She stepped backwards, bumping into Mrs. Murdo. They stood staring. Mrs. Murdo with a hand clutching Lena's shoulder. The doctor turned around and saw them. "What's the matter?" she said. Lena couldn't speak. Her eyes were fixed on the flames, which leapt higher and crackled. Mrs. Murdo tried to answer. It's... She inclined her head towards the end of the room where the first flame had become a dozen flames, licking upwards, sending out flashes of orange light. "Oh, the fire? You are not used to fire?" Mrs. Murdo managed to smile apologetically. Lena just stared. "It stays in the fireplace," the doctor said. "Not at all dangerous." In Ember, there was never fire unless there was danger. Someone's electric wiring had frayed and ignited, or a potholder had fallen on a stove's electric burner. The only fire Lena had seen that wasn't dangerous was the tiny flame of a candle. This fire scared her. In the window glass, reflections glimmered. The windows were set so deeply into the walls that there was a ledge at the bottom wide enough to sit on. The boy, Torrin, hiked himself up on one of these ledges and sat there, kicking his feet against the cabinet set into the wall below it. "Afraid of fire," he said in a low, scornful voice. "Come in," the doctor said. "You can sit over there if you like." She pointed to some chairs at the other end of the room, far from the fire, so that's where Lena and Mrs. Murdo sat. Poppy woke up enough to give a weak wail, and then she slumped into Mrs. Murdo's lap. "This will likely be the last fire of the season anyway," said the doctor. "Nights will be getting warmer soon. We won't need one." A creak sounded from outside, and then rapid footsteps. Someone pounded on the door. Lena clutched Mrs. Murdo's hand. But the doctor only sighed and moved to answer the knock. "Oh, it's you, William," she said. "What do you need?" "Some of that ointment," said a man's voice. "I need it right now. My wife cut her hand. It's bleeding all over." Come in, I'll get it," the doctor said. And she went into another room and rummaged around while the man stood shyly just inside the door, looking out of the corners of his eyes at Lena and Mrs. Murdo. The doctor brought him his jar of ointment and he went away. No more than 10 minutes later, another knock came, this time from a young woman who wanted some willow bark medicine for her sister who had a pounding headache. Again, the doctor rattled around the other room. She came out with a small bottle and the woman hurried off with it. "Are you the only doctor here?" Mrs. Murdo inquired. "Yes," said Dr. Hester. "It is a never-ending job." She suddenly looked worried. "Did I give William the right jar?" Yes. On the third shelf, yes, I'm sure I did." She gave a frazzled sigh. "Now, let's tend to your little one. Put her down here." She patted the couch that stood against the wall. "And wrap her in this." She retrieved a knitted blanket that had fallen to the floor, gave it a shake, and handed it to Mrs. Murdo. "I'll give her a swallow of medicine." Poppy accepted 2 spoonfuls of this medicine. It was something reddish that Dr. Hester poured from a jar, and she spit out the third, whimpering. Lena's heart ached to see Poppy so sick. Most of the time, Poppy was a ball of energy, so quick and curious you never knew what she would do next. She might chew up a valuable document, for instance, or trot off on an exploration of her own at exactly the wrong moment. Do you think that she's flashing back to the city of Ember? I remember the incident where Poppy chewed up the instructions, and then the second time in Looper's shop, where Poppy wandered off just as the lights went out. I think that is what the author is alluding to. Let's see. Now she was limp and pale like a little sprout that hadn't been watered. Mrs. Murdo laid her on the bed. Lena sat by her and stroked her hair, and quite soon she went to sleep. The doctor disappeared into the kitchen, and Torrin climbed the stairs and vanished into the room above. All at once, Lena was overcome with tiredness. The disorderly house, the unfriendly boy, the fire, all of it was strange and disturbing. and Poppy was terribly sick, which worried Lena so much that she felt a little sick herself. She sat down by Mrs. Murdo and laid her head on Mrs. Murdo's lap. She was vaguely aware of the clattering and chopping noises coming from the kitchen, and then she dozed off into a confusing dream of light and shadows. "Dinner!" shouted Torrin. Lena bolted upright, and he laughed. "Have you heard of food?" he said. "Have you heard of eating?" They sat at the table, all of them but Poppy, and the doctor ladled out something from a big bowl. Lena wasn't sure what it was. Cold potatoes, she thought, and something else. She ate it because she was hungry. But when she had eaten, she suddenly became so tired that she could hardly move. "Quite tasty," said Mrs. Murdo. "Thank you." "Well," said the doctor, "certainly. You're welcome." She started to stand up and then sat down again, looking flustered. "Maybe you'd like to read or walk around or—" "We're a bit tired," said Mrs. Murdo. "Perhaps we could go to bed?" Dr. Hester's face brightened. "Ah, bed, yes," she said, standing up. "Of course. Why didn't I? Okay, let's see. Where will we put you? She looked around as if an extra bed might be hidden in this mess. "The loft, I suppose." "No!" cried Torrin. "That's my room." "But it's the only place with 2 beds," said Dr. Hester. Picking up a candle, she made her way through the clutter to the stairway. "Don't touch my things! And Casper's things!" cried Torrin. "Don't be silly," said Dr. Hester, starting up the stairs. "But where will I sleep?" Torrin wailed. "In the medicine room," said Dr. Hester. Tears appeared in Torrin's eyes, but the doctor didn't notice. She disappeared into the loft, and for a few minutes Lena heard thumps and scrapes from above. "Come on up," the doctor called. Lena climbed the stairs, and Mrs. Murdo came after, carrying Poppy. By the light of the doctor's candle, Lena saw 2 beds under a sloping ceiling. There was a chest at the foot of each bed. Some clothes hung from hooks, and some boxes were neatly lined up on the sill of one window. "2 beds, but 3 of you," said the doctor, frowning. We could put the baby." "It's all right," Lena said. "She'll sleep with me." And a few minutes later, she was in bed, Poppy in the crook of her arms, covers drawn over them. "Good night," Mrs. Murdo said from the other bed, and the candle was blown out. And the room went dark, but not as dark as the rooms in Ember at night. Lena could still see a faint gray rectangle where the window was because of the lights in the sky, the silver circle and the bright pinpoints. What were they called, she wondered? And who is Casper? And how can the doctor stand to have that huge, awful fire right there in the floor of her house? Everything here was the opposite of Ember. Ember was dark and cold. This place was bright and hot. Ember was orderly. This place was disorderly. In Ember, everything was familiar to her. Here, everything was strange. Will I learn to like it here? She wondered. Will I ever feel at home? She held Poppy tight against her and listened to her snuffly breathing for a long time before she fell asleep. And we have just concluded our very first night in the village of Sparks. Are you ready for more? If you are, find me on the next video. That's where I'll be. The next one is a chapter between a chapter. We're going from chapter 4 to the first town meeting, but that's not really a chapter. And then we go on to chapter 5. Interesting how it's just tucked in there, almost like a little secret. Won't you join me over there for that? We'll see you soon.